Добре дојдовте во нов Асном. Денеска имаме еден специјален гостин кој ни доаѓа од Италија и со кого ќе продолжам да зборам и англиски заради тоа што истиот овој подкаст е наменет за нашата публика, тоест вас, и за многу други љубители, тоест за љубителите од англиското говорно подрече, кој истиот подкаст ќе биде превземен од неколку други канали. Today we have a special guest and he's coming right from Italy. He's very known in some intellectual circles in Macedonia, and he was born, apart from being born in Rome, he is a very healthy CV and resume from the academic side. His name is Adrian Waters, and his background is that he has a bachelor in history and politics from University of Kent in Canterbury, UK. Followed by Masters of Arts in History from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College in London, and second level Masters International Public Affairs at the Luis Guido Carl University in Rome. Currently, he is a PhD student at the University of Graz, Austria, and his thesis deals exclusively with the EU enlargement policies on democracy in Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia since 2014. Apart from his studies, he also worked at the Center for Research and Policy Making, the Democratic Governance Division within the Council of Europe, and at the Institute of Greater Europe. He is of Macedonian descent and he has passion for Macedonian political affairs in Macedonia. Today, exclusively, we do have Adrian Waters. Mm-hmm. Adrian, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, great. I'm great having you here. And you have a very healthy resume and CV that I'm really impressed. And hopefully today we will talk about certain topic that has engulfed this region, especially the Eastern Europe. And right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's been the plenty of topics that have been discussed, but I think that this topic is very important for the Macedonian and for the wider public, because today we will be talking about the liberal hegemony that has been engulfed us. And you have done some research and some papers that, although do not directly deal with those topics, however, you are very familiar with the subject. Can you tell our audience what do we understand under the liberal hegemony?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast to discuss this very important topic. Now, I don't want to confuse your audience, but since I'm half British and I used to live in Britain, I'm going to use the British English pronunciation of hegemony. So I won't say liberal hegemony, I'll say liberal hegemony.
Yes, so I do use the Canadian English since I lived there for over 20 years.
You're forgiven.
Absolutely, please go ahead.
Yeah, so when we talk about liberal hegemony, we're talking about a concept that was developed in the early 2000s by scholars of international relations. Now, in my view, the best definition is given by John J. Mearsheimer, the renowned scholar of neorealism or structural realism at the University of Chicago, whose fame has grown over the past 2 years over his unorthodox views on the war in Ukraine. He defined the liberal hegemony as an ambitious strategy in which a state aims to turn as many countries as possible into liberal democracies like itself, while also promoting an open international economy and building international institutions. This strategy was pursued by the United States and its allies in Europe in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the unipolar world emerged. Now, when we talk about a unipolar world, we're talking about a system in which there is only one superpower. This is in contrast to the bipolar system we had during the Cold War, when the United States and the USSR were at loggerheads with each other. Nowadays, we live in a multipolar world in which there are multiple superpowers fighting for influence. So, as I was saying, in the period after the Cold War, the United States and its European allies decided that they have to pursue liberal hegemony by extending the membership of international institutions like the European Union, while also creating a hyper-globalized international economy and spreading liberal democracy across the globe. Now, this was done with the goal of facilitating peace and economic prosperity, and also to eliminate any possible ideological rivals that might threaten the existence of liberal democracies. So, those who pursued liberal hegemony believed in the democratic peace theory. This is a theory in political science which suggests that if every country in the world is a democracy, particularly the liberal sort, then there will be no wars. There will be
democracies do not fight wars.
Exactly. And as a matter of fact, this theory has been influential in US foreign policy circles since the early 1990s. I mean, you had Bill Clinton, who used it to justify the expansion of liberal democracies in the 1990s. Then you had George W. Bush, who used it as an excuse to invade Iraq in 2003 and topple Saddam Hussein. And even Barack Obama supported this theory, as seen by his backing of anti-government rebels in Libya and Syria, and we all know how that ended. Now, just to clarify, we have to, we understand what we mean by a liberal democracy, because unfortunately not many people know. So when I'm talking about liberal democracy, I'm talking about a political system in which citizens can elect their representatives in frequent, free and fair elections. And in this system, there is political pluralism, meaning that people can choose from a variety of political parties. There is also tolerance, not only between different ethnic and religious groups, but also between people who have different political opinions. There is also the resolution of political disputes via constitutional frameworks and the rule of law. And let's not forget, we have also the separation between the three different branches of power. So there's the separation from the legislative, from the executive, and the judiciary. And most importantly, we have the protection of individual and civil rights. This political system has its basis, as you might have guessed, in political liberalism, which John James Mearsheimer defined as an ideology that is highly individualistic and which stresses the importance of rights that cannot be taken away or given up voluntarily. This ideology assumes that people will, of course, have differences on key social and political issues, but the important thing is that there is a state that ensures that these views do not lead to violence. And as such, liberalism has been the ideology that has guided the formation of the liberal international order that was established after the Cold War, and it has been established mainly via the strategy of liberal hegemony. Now, if we talk about Macedonia and the Western Balkans in particular, liberal hegemony was pursued in various ways. I mean, you have the expansion of NATO, for instance, or the adoption of the neoliberal economic policies during the 1990s, an example of which are the privatization measures that were implemented in Macedonia during the first SDSM governments led by Branko Crvenkovski in the 1990s. And we all know the suffering that, caused, to many people who lost their job or were forced to emigrate.
Unfortunately. Yes. And please go ahead.
Oh, yeah. But I think the best example of how you can how liberal hegemony was pursued in practice is how the EU tried to transform the countries in the region into liberal democracies using enlargement. Now, so the EU has pursued the liberal hegemony in the Western Balkan region from the 1990s onwards via enlargement policy mechanisms like the Stabilization and Association Process, the Stability Pact, and conditionality. What do I mean by conditionality? I mean a policy in which international organizations like the EU offer certain rewards to target countries, such as eventual EU membership, but only if the target countries fulfill one or more conditions. Usually, the EU's conditionality is related to the Copenhagen criteria that was set in 1993 at the Copenhagen European Council. And the criteria sort of says that any country that wants to join the European Union must fulfill certain conditions, namely that it has to have institutions that guarantee democracy, although it is not clearly defined, human rights, the protection of minorities, and a functioning free market economy. So as you can see, these conditions are clearly linked to the idea of liberal hegemony. But in the Western Balkans, the EU's conditionality also focused on other requirements which are not necessarily related to the Copenhagen criteria. And here I'm talking about things like the implementation of peace treaties, like the Dayton Peace Agreement in Bosnia.
Ohrid Framework Agreement.
Oh yeah, I was actually about to get to that, because the EU pursued liberal hegemony also by directly intervening in the internal affairs of sovereign states. The first case was during the late 1990s, when they attempted the regime change against the Serbian president Slobodan Milosevic. So they did this firstly via sanctions and then by supporting Montenegrin independence. In the end, as we all know, NATO finished the job with the deadly bombardment of the country. And but the thing is, the regime change did not end there. It succeeded only in the year 2000, when Milosevic was forced to hand over power to the democratic opposition of Serbia before the second round of the presidential elections that were held that year. May I remind our audience that the democratic opposition of Serbia received financial backing from both the US and the EU.
It's a colored revolution.
Yeah, it was the first example of a color revolution, and the sort of template was used later in other countries such as Georgia.
Georgia, Ukraine, Macedonia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can talk at length.
So it's all started the colored revolution and the hegemony, that it had I would say, academic pretext of Copenhagen criteria, division of the powers within the countries. Yet there was a heavy interference within the countries.
Exactly, and this was also clearly seen in Macedonia in 2001 during the conflict between this country's security forces and the ethnic Albanian terrorists grouped under the National Liberation Army. So the EU and the US tried to put an end to the conflict in various ways by giving incentives to the government at the time. I mean, Macedonia was the first country in the Western Balkans to sign a stabilization and association agreement in April 2001. And this was used as an incentive for the government to try and find a compromise with the terrorists. But in the end, as we all know, Macedonia was forced to ratify the Ohrid Framework Agreement under US and EU pressure. And this framework agreement tried to resolve Macedonia's interethnic problems with two liberal solutions. So one is decentralization, and second is the inclusion of ethnic minorities in every kind of level of governance. So the decentralization of the state, in which sort of municipalities began to sort of take control over certain policy areas such as education. But then you also had the Badinter majority system, in which certain laws will require not only a majority of lawmakers within the Macedonian parliament, but also a majority within the lawmakers who are members of the ethnic minorities in Macedonia.
Absolutely, and when it comes to the division of the local power and drawing the map, the gerrymandering has been heavily used in Macedonia, which is forbidden in the United States, where you create a map of certain local municipality based on the ethnic structure of that municipality. So there is a wider implementation of the Ohrid Framework Agreement, and that means that the minority would exert pressure on the majority by having abide by the Ohrid Framework Agreement rules. Would you agree with that?
No, of course. I mean, and you had also the EU, which sort of constantly interfered in domestic affairs here in Macedonia to just ensure that this framework agreement is implemented.
Yes, by doing a various conditionality of the reports and the progress reports. And that was, I read one of your papers, which I agree absolutely. You're claiming that that the security was the main issue for the European Union's interference in the domestic political affairs. Yes. Isn't that the only issue, or there were some other issues as well?
I mean, as a matter of fact, Macedonia gained its candidate status in 2005, not because of domestic politics, not because of the internal reforms, but because it satisfied the condition of implementing the Ohrid agreement, and also because at the time the EU was worried that if Macedonia did not receive a candidate status, then it would have a destabilizing effect on the internal politics of the country. And so this brings on to my next.
And I'm sorry, I'll interrupt that. It just that type of a policy, it seems that it encourages the minority ethnic Albanian political parties to pursue policy of not repression, but lots of pressure of various kinds, whether it's political, whether it's any idea of moral suasion, I would say, that can create a potential for destabilizing the country. And that, the policies of conditionality instilled that type of attitude, and we see even now that such political pressures. Would you agree with that?
Of course, definitely. I mean, this is not just a problem just here in Macedonia, also in other ethnically divided countries. Mm-hmm. You can talk a lot about also Bosnia and Kosovo, for instance, or even Montenegro.
So on one way, the European Union was concerned about the security of the country, was encouraging policy of wide implementation of Ohrid Framework Agreement, yet it was encouraging such a negative tendencies that we've been living throughout the last 20 years. It's kind of an oxymoron in that way. They're concerned with the security of a country, yet the policies that are being implemented are destabilizing the country itself.
Well, this is so leads on to my other point, because there's a lot of talk in the literature about what is called the democratization stabilization dilemma, because there are moments in which the EU has to choose whether to focus on the democracy promotion or on the safeguarding its security, material, or economic or political interests. And in many cases, it has to choose the latter. And so it has to choose stabilization over democratization. And this brings me on to my other point, yes, that in the short term, there were some successes to the pursuit of liberal hegemony in the Western Balkan region, not just in Macedonia. According to Freedom House, which is a US organization dealing with democratization, in 2009, most of the countries in the region were semi-consolidated democracies. I mean, you had Macedonia, you had Albania, you had Croatia, Montenegro, Serbia. And so this showed that regardless of what we might think of the union's conditions, the conditions were certainly useful for the elites to adopt reforms which they never would have adopted before if it wasn't for the EU's influence. And so, because of this, the EU is still regarded to this day in Macedonia and in the Western Balkan region as a role model and as an institution that is capable of persuading elites to adopt reforms which maybe might not have been adopted in the first place. Now, of course, these are just relative successes, because then, because of various issues, the pursuit of liberal hegemony was not entirely successful. I mean, the first issue I mentioned about the democratization stabilization dilemma, that has occurred because the EU's pursuit of liberal hegemony was motivated mainly by realpolitik, by pragmatic concerns and by the security interests of its member states. Because after they've seen what has happened, in Yugoslavia during its dissolution and all the wars and the instability and the refugee flows that ensued, they decided that they have to stabilize the countries in the region. And to do so, they decided to combine democracy promotion with security priorities. So they thought that if they provided liberal solutions to the problems of the countries, they would have a stable backyard. And so, but as I said, there were always some moments in which they had to choose whether to promote democracy or to maintain stability. And in many cases, they had to choose the latter. I mean, we can talk at length about the democratization process in Bosnia during the early 2000s, which was effectively undermined by the EU's prioritization of stability. There were fears in Brussels that if domestic reforms were adopted and implemented, then there would be interethnic violence. And this is why Bosnia-Herzegovina has, to this day, maintained the status of a hybrid regime. Now, for those of you who don't know, I mean, a hybrid regime is a political system in which there are elements of democracy, so like frequent elections, but there are also authoritarian practices like electoral irregularities, government control over the judiciary, pressure on the media, repression of political dissidents. So that's the first issue. And the second issue is that the EU's conditionality focused excessively on the political elites and rarely involved ordinary citizens and civil society. And so a lot of the EU's reforms actually threatened the position of these elites in the Western Balkan countries. And that is why they adopted these liberal reforms, but they never actually implemented them. So, ironically, this approach actually strengthened the power of these authoritarian elites in the Western Balkans.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, well, we are seeing those, the same authoritarian parties, political parties are just changing without any particular solution to the economic model of our country. At least I can testify to that for sure. Now, how this is a dilemma. It imposes dilemma to ordinary citizen. Is that like where we are there any benefits of introducing the liberal hegemony on our upon our countries where we do have hybrid systems? Because as you pointed out, I feel that we do live in a hybrid system here in Macedonia. It's not just in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What's your opinion?
Well, the thing is, it is in a way something that the EU wants, not because it really wants to. I mean, if we still lived in a unipolar system, maybe all the countries in the region would actually be much more democratic. But this is due to a series of issues. So another issue that must be pointed out is that this phenomenon of direct intervention in the internal affairs of sovereign states has created a culture of dependency in extreme cases like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and arguably even Macedonia, which have been labeled as quasi-protectorates. Now, another issue is also that liberal hegemony maybe would have been even more successful in the region if it wasn't for the fact that the countries like Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, and Albania are still grappling with the problems such as state capture, clientelism, corruption, and organized crime. And this proves Mia Scheimer's point that the imposition of liberal democracy can only occur if there are favorable domestic conditions. These are economic prosperity, a powerful central government, ethnic and religious homogeneity, and also previous experiences with democracy. And another issue is that the emergence of multipolarity coincided with the emergence of multiple crises that affected the European Union. We can talk at length about the Eurozone crisis, the migrant refugee crisis, Brexit, COVID, and so on. And all these problems led to enlargement fatigue and therefore less EU democracy promotion in the region. So it is not necessarily the fault of the Western Balkan countries that they're in this state. So as Freedom House pointed out, there has been a process of democratic backsliding in these countries. So it started with Albania, which became a hybrid regime in 2010, and then Macedonia by 2013, followed by Kosovo in 2016, and Serbia and Montenegro by 2019. But going back to democratization, stabilization, these countries have been labeled in the literature as stabilitocracies. A stabilitocracy is a term invented by the Montenegrin scholar Srđa Pavlović, who used this term to describe regimes that were led by pro-EU leaders who were self-declared Democrats but were actually very authoritarian and whose controversial practices are ignored by the EU as long as they satisfy geostrategic interests or provide some form of stability. And you have multiple examples of such stabilitocratic leaders. You have Milo Đukanović in Montenegro, the former president and prime minister of Montenegro. Another famous example is Aleksandar Vučić, the current president of Serbia. Some people even labeled the former Macedonian prime minister Nikola Gruevski a stabilitocratic leader. And others would say even Zoran Zaev was a stabilitocratic leader. Now, and also because of multipolarity, the EU started to face competition from other great powers such as Russia, China, the Gulf states, and Turkey. And in this process, the stabilitocratic leaders have learned to play the EU against these other powers for their own benefits. I mean, you see Aleksandar Vučić, who has very good relations with the EU, but also with Russia and China. I mean, he allowed the construction of an EU-sponsored lithium mine, despite all the environmental protests that have occurred. And also, he still accepts investments from China, and he has refused to impose sanctions on Moscow after the Ukraine war started 2 years ago. Well, unfortunately for Macedonia, it wasn't allowed to follow such, kind of balancing position between the two sides. We can talk at length about the former Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski, who accepted the investments from China. And he also wanted Macedonia to participate in the South Stream pipeline, or the fact that he refused to impose sanctions on Russia after the Ukrainian crisis began in 2014. And I think this is precisely why the EU decided to support the rise to power of Zoran Zaev through the colorful revolution that we saw in 2015, 2016. And as we all know, this all led to the illegal name change, which was actually encouraged by people like the former EU Commissioner for Enlargement, Johannes Hahn, who encouraged Zaev to use a combination of the Balkan and rational approach to obtain a two-thirds majority in the parliament. And we all know that Zaev obtained the two-thirds majority by bribing, coercing, and blackmailing 8 members of the opposition. But so in a way, so the EU behaved in a more pragmatic manner, not in a liberal manner, because they removed a government that threatened its interests and installed a friendly authoritarian one, because Macedonia under Zaev was still labeled as a hybrid regime by Freedom House. And now the situation is pretty dire because, as Mearsheimer said, liberal hegemony can only be pursued in a unipolar system. It cannot be pursued in a bipolar or unipolar system, because in a multipolar or bipolar system, liberal powers have to behave in a realist manner towards competing powers. But in the sort of behaving in this pragmatic manner, they will also use liberal rhetoric as a facade and to present themselves as better than their opponents. But yeah, the situation is dire because enlargement is back on the agenda due to the Ukraine war, but apart from the fact that it is still not known whether further enlargement will occur in practice, it is clear that geopolitical issues will make accession prospects less sincere, especially because the EU is less likely to promote liberal democracy if it needs to integrate candidate countries quickly to safeguard its liberal order and to challenge competing powers. Not only that, many people in Macedonia and across the Western Balkans are disillusioned with the EU and are more happy to accept the alternatives offered by Russia and China. We have some stabilitocratic leaders who have disappeared from the scene, like Milo Djukanovic, while some others, like Aleksandar Vučić, are still in power, and they have become even more authoritarian thanks to the backing of the EU and from the backing of certain groups in society. And this goes back to Mearsheimer's point that the liberal argument that the citizens of liberal democracies respect the popular democratic rights is flawed, because there's always the possibility that liberal democracies, especially the fledgling ones that emerged in Eastern Europe after the Cold War, would revert to authoritarianism. And so I think that the phenomenon of stabilitocracy that we see today will continue, unfortunately. But as a result of this, as you can see, there is no stability nor democracy anywhere in the Western Balkans. This reminded me of a quote by Benjamin Franklin, which is often misused in the American media. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. But in the case of the Western Balkans, we can say that if you sacrifice democracy for stability, you will get neither democracy nor stability.
Absolutely. And this is how I feel we are living through those horrible dark times where democracy or the illusion of democracy is being promoted, yet we don't see any of it. And the economic development of our country is the testament to it. Now, what is the solution for such a small country as ours that we can get out of these dark times? You mentioned that there is a heavy interference by the Western powers, not allowing to have any other choice other than EU-NATO. Yet, it seems to me that with the development of the New World Order, the rise of BRICS, 57% of the population is there. Young, vibrant countries with lots of development potential. 43 to 45% of the GDP is located there, and with the respect of the democratic institution of any country versus the democracies that are being offered on the West. What is the solution for our country?
That's $1 million question. Also, just before I continue, I would like to point out that, well, as I mentioned, Aleksandar Vučić, he is okay in good terms with the EU, but he still maintains also good ties with Russia and China. So
yes,
he is taking advantage of multipolarity. But that's because even before he took power, Serbia always had this national strategy of neutrality, sort of.
Neutrality, yes.
Neutrality. I mean, even Montenegro under Milo Đukanović continued to accept investments from Russia and China. But the fact is that he continued to implement a pro-Western foreign policy by recognizing the independence of Kosovo and by imposing sanctions on Russia.
Yes.
So I think it's more the problem that is more like, okay, if you follow the common foreign and security policy of the EU, you'll be fine. If you don't follow it, you won't be fine, unless you're Vučić. But that's because he's very good at making bilateral deals with the European Union member states. I mean, he recently bought a lot of Rafale fighter planes from France. But also, they like him also because he was the only leader in Serbia who would try to find a solution to the
Kosovo problem.
To the Kosovo problem,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's why he's in power. And also because when he took power for the first time as prime minister in 2014, there was already a sense that enlargement was not going to happen in the near future. And that was a win-win situation for him and for the European European Union at the time. Now, going back to your question about what can we do about it, my answer is not a simple one, because much will depend on what Donald Trump will do once he takes office again in January. I read that he wants to impose a 10 to 20% tariff on
goods coming from China.
Well, not just China, also from the EU. And so
Okay.
if this happens, there's a possibility that exports from Europe going to the US will decrease. And so there might be sort of economic tensions between the two sides. But some people think that maybe this could be a force for good for the EU, because then it might spur the EU leaders to adopt changes to their decision-making processes, like maybe removing the veto power in foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. At the Council of Ministers of the EU. Okay, yeah.
So that's something we might see, but I don't want to make any predictions.
Yeah, it's difficult to make a prediction, but yeah, for a small country as ours, do you think that the majority of political parties proclaim that EU is the only alternative, which is sometimes senseless from the economic point of view? Do you think that country like Macedonia, Montenegro, or Bosnia can pursue more sovereign path towards its development rather than being subjugated to the EU's and Washington's political will?
But that unfortunately depends much on the will of the governments. And so, I mean, I saw that in Macedonia that the current center-right government led by Vomero Dopomene and Prime Minister Hristijan Mickoski has been trying to position itself close to Trump. So I guess there will be a lot of leaders in the Western Balkans who would like to have good ties with Donald Trump. I mean, Vučić is certainly one of them, also Milorad Dodik in Republika Srpska.
Absolutely.
See. And from what I read, some people believe that the Macedonian Prime Minister Hristijan Mickoski wants to have good ties with Trump because he thinks that maybe he would help to resolve the dispute with Bulgaria. But we will see. I mean, maybe Trump will teach him the art of the deal. But let us not...
That's the book that Trump has written, and it was a bestseller in the US.
Yes. Many years ago.
Many years ago,
yes. But the thing is, we should not forget that the Prespa Agreement and all the things that happened because of it, these were done during the first term of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Exactly. So my advice to Mickoski would be careful what you wish for.
It might never happen. Yes.
No. But so I've been thinking a lot about what ordinary people can do about it, especially here in Macedonia. But I think there needs to be a sort of change in how people perceive the EU. I mean, there already are many ordinary people who are critical of the EU's behavior towards Macedonia and towards the other countries in the region, and who are critical also of liberal hegemony as such, like Novasnom. So I would encourage organizations like Novasnom to increase their presence in the public sphere. We will organize more sort of open events, sort of invite members of the public to come in, and discuss certain topics that might not be mentioned in the mainstream media, and so provide a platform for unorthodox voices to be heard. Maybe you could even invite John J. Mearsheimer on the show one day.
I would love to.
Yes.
That would be really good.
I mean, I was recently here in Skopje for a conference organized by the Global Changes Center of the University St. Clement and Methodius University here in Skopje, and it was all a huge discussion of multipolarism, and we had a lot of prominent professors like Radika Desai, and also my former professor at Kent, Richard Sakwa. But also we had talks by the Chinese embassy's charge d'affaires, yes, and the Russian ambassador to Macedonia. So I think that we should sort of increase, the number of such events in the public sphere. So
more people will get informed, because now the information is critical. Under this liberal hegemony, there is another, you were talking about the political sphere. However, there is another sphere that is being, I would say, controlled, although lots of people will say this is a conspiracy theory. However, the media is being controlled by injecting lots of foreign money that tries to take certain narrative that voices such Novasnom cannot be heard, and that narrative is pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-NATO.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that?
Well, of course, that can be said also about other countries, but it's good that you continue in your work anyhow.
Oh, absolutely,
yeah, and exactly because of this, you have to sort of increase your presence in the public sphere. I mean, I saw that you had a press conference that was shown on the Canal Pet here in Macedonia.
Yes, that was a really good one. And that's one of the challenges, increasing the public eye on public activity. That's a good idea, and that will be something that we will be working towards. Are there any other suggestions that you might suggest?
Well, so going back to what I was saying earlier, in sort of trying to increase your public sphere, you also have to try to get, the young people involved, because they're the future of this country.
Absolutely, yes.
And also to have to reach out to other members of the ethnic communities here in Macedonia. So like ethnic Albanians, the Turks, the Vlachs, the Roma, the Serbs, the Bosniaks, and so on. But in doing so, it has to be emphasized that liberal values as such, and here I'm talking about values such as the rule of law, the respect for civil and individual rights, and also ethnic and religious tolerance, and that all these values are actually positive for a country's domestic politics, of course. I think we all agree with that. But as Mearsheimer said, liberalism is a poor guide for foreign policy, and this is something that ordinary people and political elites need to understand. Because the liberal hegemony is actually harms the countries that it seeks to help, and so as he said, that's
so pursuing a more nationalistic, sovereign type of
focusing on balance of power, and sort of looking out for mutual interests with the EU, for instance. And this leads to my next point, that of course, while you're increasing your presence in the public sphere, you should make it clear that Macedonians do not want to be enemies of the European Union, because the EU is the country's largest trading partner, and the Macedonian citizens have the right to travel to Schengen area countries for a period of up to 90 days. And so it has to be made clear that Macedonians want to be equal partners with the EU, and that the search for alternatives can be seen as complementary to EU membership. I've been an advocate for some time for Macedonia's membership in the European Economic Area as a way of receiving the economic benefits of the EU single market while staying out of the political institutions while they try to reform themselves.
Can that happen without fulfilling the obligation of Prespa and Bulgarian agreement?
Sadly not. Sadly not. I mean, as I said, we need to see what happens under Trump. Maybe he will manage to come up with some kind of deal between the EU, Macedonia, and Bulgaria. But also this leads me to my next point, that there needs to be changes at a systemic level, because that is where things happen. You know, you can't do much if you're not inside the system. And so, in my view, there need to be a lot more critical voices in the parliament. So voices that are critical of the EU's behavior in Macedonia, in the Western Balkans, voices that are critical of liberal hegemony, and that are in favor of a multipolar world. And here in Macedonia, we have Levica, which is a strong advocate for such positions, and I feel like that's positive for those who are opposed to liberal hegemony as such. But obviously, I think matters would be even better if there are changes to the electoral system in Macedonia. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Macedonian politics, there are 6 electoral units in the country, and it is a closed list proportional system, but there are 6 electoral units, 7 if you count the one for the diaspora. And many people have called for these electoral units to be reduced to 1, because the results that are produced during the parliamentary elections are not exactly proportionate, and
nor fair.
Nor fair, because they tend to favor the establishment parties and the parties of the ethnic Albanian minority.
Yeah, it's not a strange. It's a engineered political system that is tailored towards 2 largest Macedonian parties and the smaller Albanian parties. No one else. And the numbers just prove that. We have like 7,500 Albanian votes will produce 1 Albanian MP, while 11,000 Macedonian votes will not produce 1 MP. And that's a disbalance that lead to frustration, and just an additional argument that this is not a right system for us.
Exactly. And I know that one of the governing parties of Omar Dipperman promised in their manifesto that they would change this to sort of reduce the number of electoral units to 1. So I think that ordinary Macedonians should make sure that they are held accountable for this, that they actually do this. Because if they don't do it by the next parliamentary election, then it means that the people will have to sign a petition for it to become a question for a referendum. And so this leads on to my next point, that in my view, people in Macedonia should give their support to non-establishment parties. Not just at a national level, but also at the local level. Just, to start small, so to speak. I mean, I expect that Levica will do well in the next local elections, which are set for next year in autumn. And I expect that they will increase the number of municipal councillors, and maybe even they will gain some mayoral positions. Now, for the other minor parties, which I know do exist, and in my view there are far too many, they should try to sort of make electoral pacts with one another, at least for these local and national elections. And so this sort of leads on to my final point, that people should try to keep the government to account in every possible way. If you're unhappy about a certain situation, you should not be silent about it. You should make your voice heard. I saw recently in the Eastern Macedonia, in Kočani, there were protests against the rising pollution levels there. So the current government should not take the public support it received during the last presidential and parliamentary elections for granted. They must be aware that if they do not fulfill their expectations, that they will also suffer at the next parliamentary elections. So we have to make sure that there is no stability within a stabilitocracy.
That's the sure way to shake the system and the current balance of power in Macedonia, and to give a chance or give a rise to some other views that are alternative to the current prevailing ones. Well, Adrian, really thank you. This was very, very revealing, very informative. You do have a great knowledge from an international point of view, right up to our local political ones, and you have demonstrated that. I greatly appreciate you being my guest. Hopefully, this is one of a series of interviews that we will be doing in the future, and hopefully you will come back to see us again.
Yeah, thank you very much again for the invitation, and I wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Благодарам што не следевте во овој интересно интервју. До следното видување, се најдобро.